Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 86 of the Blowback Roundtable. We have our regular panel, Ben Toth and Paige Hungry, Ian Kummer from a suburb in Moscow, Carlo Parcelli from Washington, D.C., capital, belly of the beast, Satan's anus, Washington, D.C. Max Parry is joining us live from New York City. And thank you so much, Max, for being our special guest and for the panelists joining me as we do every Tuesday and Friday. Today is our title for today's program is, what is it? So we put the Russians are everywhere, but our thumbnail says what, Ben?
Well, the initial title was The Russians Are Everywhere, which kind of stayed in, the queue for the show, but they actually replaced, I think, that the elections, meaning the European elections, rock the Atlantic boat. I think that became the thumbnail, so sorry about that. But we're going to touch a little bit on both. We always have a little debate before the show what the fuck we should call it, and then sometimes it has no relation to what's discussed. But as you mentioned, The Russians Are Everywhere does have a source.
Yeah, we like to touch on the breaking current news, and obviously this is one of the biggest breaking current news stories about how well the anti-Ukraine war parties did in the European elections. So yeah, there was basically a protest vote kind of against these anti-Russian policies that's harming the EU economy, and of course. What does the West do? The West is going to blame Russia and Putin for these electoral defeats or these problematic electoral results. What else are they going to do except blame Putin? So this goes back to 2016, where they're dusting off the 2016 playbook where Putin was blamed for everything, especially Trump. But did you have?
Go ahead, Brexit Matt? Was Putin too. Okay.
Yeah, Brexit. That of course.
Not Farage, who's back.
The meme was, the dogs were blaming Putin when they pooped in the living room, and it was just kind of emblematic of the ridiculous propaganda that was being shoved down everybody's throat. But Ben, did you have a clip from somebody saying?
Apparently Billy Bob has, but apparently Ian has, but Billy Bob hasn't seen the clip. This is Admiral Rob Bauer, the Dutchman from the Netherlands, Admiral of, I think, maybe the military aspect of NATO or something. And, the Russians have been degraded by Ukraine, like 500,000 have died. They basically can't do anything. But on the other hand, we have this clip where he's saying, they're everywhere, but take a listen.
Second. Then there is the discussion on what the next target might be, whether it is in NATO or outside NATO. But the Russians are basically everywhere. They are in space, they are in cyber, they are in Africa, where they use the Africa Corps, the former Wagner Group, to destabilize nations. They are in the Arctic, they are in the Atlantic Ocean. So they are everywhere, trying to create strategic dilemmas for the alliance, and if there's other opponents, and so that is something we will be vigilant on. We have to make sure that we keep on looking 360 degrees in all domains: space, cyber, land, maritime, air, to make sure that we understand what.
Okay, that was Mr. Rob Bauer, and my commentary is good. They don't have bases all over the world, so if they can cause these strategic difficulties, I think you guys know that there's a flotilla of a missile destroyer and the latest generation submarine somewhere in the coast of Florida going to Cuba right now. Good, do that. But it's still Schrödinger's Russia who can't do anything. They're basically fighting with shovels, and on the other hand, they're launching space missions with China, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere. That's where the original title idea came from. Yeah.
Well, on top of that, it's kind of like, we've all, it's fun how every Western school kid as a kid, it has read 1984, and there's no irony in that whatsoever. But also there is an interesting tidbit in that, how, that whole trope of we're at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia, and people don't remember who we were at war with last week. And the way Orwell describes it, he's talking about a world that's somehow stuck like in the early 20th century, doesn't have internet or anything like that. And all newspaper clippings are destroyed so people can't look at them later. But it's interesting how it wasn't even necessary to do that. People don't remember what we were talking about 6 months ago or a year ago and see the absurdity of it, how today's narrative is contradicting yesterday's narrative.
The Ministry of Truth, is that what he called it?
Yes, the Ministry of
thing.
Truth.
It's a real thing.
And it's
I'm
kind of
sorry,
like,
that doesn't happen. Someone's at the door.
Oh, he knew I was going to throw it to him. So Ben is going to break down specifically, which parties did well and which parties did poorly. I know all the parties that were in power that were, supporting this, war against Ukraine, the economic, sanctions against Russia. They all did very poorly. You wanna tell us at least the main countries, like in Hungary, your country, and then Germany and France.
I'm going to give you a bit of a broad outline of how this works, because it's not exactly like a parliamentary election in a certain nation. What it looks like, this is the final result when it comes to basically these groupings, right? These are the many national parties, right? Who take part and then get grouped in the end. I unfortunately, this was the latest I could got, this is basically Ursula's party, the center right, the EPP. They call it the People's Party. They still have a comfortable majority, so nothing really upset there. The Liberals went way down. Apparently, the right wing surge, which is causing problems. But what this did was cause issues in local governments, so member states in the EU, which the most obvious were the biggest economies, which is France and Germany. But I just want you to understand the process. This whole thing, the European Parliament, is like a rubber stamp, a way to legitimize and make everything look democratic. These guys cannot do anything but discuss legislation and maybe recommend some amendments to it. That's it. Legislation at the European level begins with Ursula von der Leyen, right? The Commission. She is not elected by this parliament or by the people. She's selected by the national governments and then ends up and can be put into law by Charles Michel, the other end of it, which is the European Council, right? That's where the real power lies. This whole thing doesn't really matter, but it can make and break national governments. So what it was projected to do, and many were hoping, like the rogue countries, people who didn't behave, which is Hungary, and basically Slovakia, that the alternatives would rise and challenge, and they didn't. That didn't work. But that same thing actually happened, like in drastic ways, in Germany and in France. Now, in Germany, the AfD, the uprising, what they call far-right coalition, who I don't see many, other than you can say, I guess, the immigration attitudes they have. I don't see anything much far right about it. And the far left, which is Sarah Wagenknecht's Bündnis or Union Party, they rose. And the fucking Greens, the center still stayed. The Greens, which is Baerbock and Habeck and these bastards, they got their asses kicked. The photos, I wish I had them, of them seeing the results, is amazing. And both these parties said we want a snap election now, and Olaf Scholz and his party said no. But in France, it's, I always mix Meloni up with this girl Le Pen, who's probably going to be Meloni and do the exact same thing. Basically got a huge surge, and somehow Mr. Emmanuel Macron, right, the tiny Napoleon, like preemptively said he's going to call a snap elections, which are parliamentary elections, right? For 3 years he remains president. That's not going to be debated or elected, but he's going to hand over basically domestic policy to someone, which right now looks like Le Pen and her whites. So these are the big upsets, which really could be, domino effect, because a lot of the news coming out of Ukraine is, this is bad news for our long-term support. This is bad news. Ursula von der Leyen, it's not just a far-right surge, which was, I kind of resisted that title, was because she's still, what do you call it? Not the council, but the commissioner.
EPP is the strongest political group in the European Parliament. EPP has the most leaders. Together with others, we will build a bastion against the extremes from the left and from the right.
Right? That's the new European narrative. Those extremes who don't behave, who just don't take the diktat given in Washington to this bitch and then handed down, they have to be dealt with. But that they're clinging on to power.
World War III, if you don't want economic catastrophe in Western Europe or Eastern Europe, you're an extremist, Ben.
Or I really want to show this is much shorter. This is a German. I don't know which one of the Lamplight Coalition, the three, but it's got subtitles, so hang in there. Or if you just care about what the fuck people want, look at this.
Ich finde es auch nicht richtig, dass man da immer die Sorgen und Nöte der Bevölkerung ernst nehmen muss.
The concerns and needs of the population, why should we take that seriously? And then she goes on.
Was haben die denn für Sorgen?
What worries and needs do they
Ich
have?
verstehe das nicht.
I don't understand.
Yeah.
That is the German elite in one picture. And these guys reflexively giving everything to Ukraine. It doesn't matter what happens at home. It doesn't matter what happens at the economy. They got a huge uprising, at least on the cameras, on the legitimacy arm of the EU on their hands. And that is a good thing to happen. So that's kind of the summary of what it did. It didn't really do much on the surface, but it did show this.
That's interesting about, I didn't realize that Macron was not putting himself up for vote.
There was murmurs that there was calls for him to resign. And he said, he clearly said, the Elysee said, no, we're not going to do that.
So he just wants to hand domestic policy over to the right wing.
Yeah, there was numerous articles saying he laid a trap for Le Pen, saying they could lead, and because they're so stupid, they're going to lead us into chaos, and then he can take back power, and that's his big gamble. I don't know. I don't know about that.
For a long time, he's been, sort of strategically and opportunistically adopting their rhetoric to save himself. I mean, he is, dog whistled at times, like about the banning of the hijab. He's made, there was that point where he said that NATO was brain dead, and he's at times made these statements that are very much in contrast to what his actual policies are most of the time. But that's clearly, and you even see Biden does this too, where like with this latest immigration thing, where he's essentially passing some of the same measures that Trump did when he was in office. It's sometimes we really talk out of both sides of their mouth, and Macron is quintessential when it comes to that. Where
he's hated in France.
Politically, he'll adopt right-wing rhetoric only in very specific instances. So his doing that, with the national rally ascendant and Le Pen, I would predict that she's going to be the next leader of the country. Not now, but if things continue to go in this direction, it seems pretty much inevitable.
Well, do you remember? Well, I think that's kind of what Max was touching on. Saying one thing and doing another. That is virtue signaling. There was a lot of that from Biden too. I mean, because if you pay attention to American media, they've really been selling him as he's tough on immigration. Biden is the tough on immigration president. It's when his policies have been putting basically a Band-Aid on the issue to look like he's doing something about it. So
at the last minute, basically, I think he passed a recent law to cut down, like do something with the southern border, but not earlier.
What happened was and that was when the 60. Well, I know the media has already completely moved on from the issue, but that 61 billion, or I'm sorry, $100-something billion bill that was trapped in hell forever, the money for Ukraine and money for Israel, and they were trying to tack the immigration reform on it. And when people actually looked at, and the media kept saying, "Oh, well, this is a tough on immigration bill." You actually look at it, the cap on the number of immigrants they would let pass the border without locking down, closing the border was very high. So basically it wasn't actually any kind of immigration reform. Even from the Republican perspective, it would have been crazy to even consider it as a compromise because it wasn't a compromise.
That's what these guys do so well. Remember the Democratic, I don't know if it's Congress or whatever, people kneeling down and doing the kente cloth.
Yes.
Black Lives Matter. It was just a performance. Just the performance. Nothing actually happened legislation-wise, but they do this.
So, I mean, that was kind of the point I wanted to make. How are we to understand all these things? And it's funny because, I see folks like Jeffrey Sachs and other analysts that are, that are good, compared to what is on the mainstream, but they're always scratching their heads, right? They're always saying, I don't understand why the German government would, implement these policies that are destructive to the Germany's people. Like, why doesn't the German government represent their people? And they're just confused. They just don't get it.
They're occupied.
But anybody with a class analysis, with an understanding and looking at things through the perspective of oppositional class interests, understands that there's a global elite class of oligarchs that work together to further their interests. And that's why. And they don't give a fuck about the people. And of course, that one lady that you just showed that says, why do we even care about what the people think? Like, what problems do they have anyway? Like, that's their attitude. But, of course, they usually don't say that explicitly. But
I'll show you one more just to break the ice or have something funny. This is Miss Strack-Zimmermann, one of the German MPs who was at the forefront of let's send Taurus, let's send everything to Ukraine, one of those cheerleader chicks. This is what she had on stage before the elections.
Ob sie es hören wollen oder nicht.
Oh God.
I like the arm movement too, but it was just low enough not to be confused with the
Yeah,
original.
that was almost a Roman salute there. She better be careful.
What she's yelling in that tone is whether you like to
Ob sie
hear
es
it or
hören
not.
wollen oder nicht. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah, the OUN Nazi slogan. This is the
Don't
leadership.
mention the war.
Yes. Last one. Sorry about these people. That's why I did have some Schadenfreude when these guys
Same thing
lost
with the pipeline. Why do all of Europe sign on to that, and why don't they blow the whistle? Why aren't they up in arms about the U.S. destroying their economy by destroying that pipeline? Again, it's because they're not. They have their own side, and they're against the people, and so they're trying to further their own interests, their own interests of empire at the expense of the people, while pretending to represent the people. And I mean, it's an impossible task. It's untenable, but that's what we see. And that explains, why these leaders are doing things opposite the interests of their people over and over again. And it's why Jeffrey Sachs, and I think these analysts that don't understand class struggle, don't even talk about the word class, it's perplexing to me. It's like, really? You don't know? You're really scratching your head? Go ahead, Max.
Well, Jeffrey Sachs, I mean, he's a former, you couldn't be more of an insider. He knows how the sausage gets made because he was,
plundered Russia.
He's one of the economic genocidaires in free market shock therapy in post-Soviet Russia. So I think he's clearly it's understandable why he's naive about a lot of things, because I think he's still going through this kind of like crossing the Rubicon where he's suddenly realizing what he's been involved in and he's trying to make up for it. And, more power to him. I mean, it's been great because they're forced to take him seriously because he is Jeffrey Sachs. He's a former IMF economist and all that. So, but, I think that, I mean, in the case of these, what's taking place, I just don't know. I mean, I'll dish it over to you guys, but I think in his case, that's what I would say.
I do want to, I add that, Jeffrey Sachs was a Milton Friedman Chicago School flack, and so that's a long way to come. I have a question though for you guys, and that is, people are shifting. And Billy Bob's right. There is a growing gap between the elite and the general population, and it was really obvious in one of those quotes. I mean, she just basically gave up the game. But what was the reason? What are the reasons? Maybe we can delineate it for our audience. What are the reasons for the shift? Is it Ukraine? Is it the economy that's been degraded because of the war in Ukraine? What are the major reasons?
Are you asking Europe or the US or both? Because they kind of match in this.
I think they both. You could. I mean, it's decades in the making, but in the case of the U.S. especially, it's the deindustrialization, the crumbling infrastructure, that plus all the the resources of the treasury being sent towards what? Defense spending, endless defense spending, and foreign aid. So eventually people are going to wake up and see that what's happening, and eventually they're also going to see that it's a bipartisan thing, because these so-called Eurosceptic right-wing populist parties, and certainly Trump, don't represent a real alternative. Because look at somebody like Maloney. As soon as she simply uses that stuff for leverage, she flipped on a dime over to being pro-Ukraine as soon as she got in there, and she's now van der Leyen is treating her like she's some kind of acolyte, or So they clearly are.
What's going to happen to
most of them are very, very insincere, and so. In Germany's case, I think a lot of this has to do with there's an element of blackmail. I mean, we know from the Edward Snowden revelations that they don't trust Germany with Russia's economic foothold there, to the point where they were. I was just talking about this on John Stepling's podcast. They were tapping Angela Merkel's personal phone, the private telecommunications of the German president.
Yeah.
Her successor. I mean, it's they not only are under occupation, but they're under this surveillance state where the U.S. just they've got everything hanging over their head, and where they have to get in line. And Germany's committing economic suicide with what they're doing.
See, that's what the global South, at the SPIEF conference, I think Vladimir Putin made a point of this, that they are learning that Germany didn't learn, that with the U.S. bases comes the CIA, comes the NGO, comes the surveillance, comes the blackmail, and you have no sovereign decision-making left. And that is poor old Germany. Unfortunately for France, I like to bring up that he was taken to China on that beautiful, let's have in the sunset, have some tea. Look, this is what it's like to be a leader, pampered by Xi Jinping. And he said, show me strategic autonomy. He liked to use this phrase, like, show me you have an independent foreign policy from the US. And then he went back and he invited Joe Biden, who likely shat himself at the beach in Normandy, now basically trying to be the favorite in Europe to that. And it's gone. And that's why the second China trip, which began in Paris and they went to the Pyrenees, basically it was a complete, like, Xi Jinping didn't care anymore. It was like, let me just get out of here. Let me get this over with. There's nothing here. Yeah, no autonomy in Germany or in France. At least this is a signal from the people, from the voting population, saying, you don't represent us. What is called the left here never represented us. Who the fuck do we turn to? That's a major turning point, I think. Go ahead, Max.
Well, don't forget with Germany too. I mean, they really sold their post-war sovereignty during the post-war World War II reconstruction. I mean, where they had their debt alleviated, and they didn't have to pay any significant reparations, despite destroying the entire continent, basically. And so but in doing that, they basically handed over their sovereignty for the last 75 years.
Yeah, they in Japan were built up. If you see somewhere NED funding and you see somewhere German Marshall Fund, they're the same thing. That's why they're completely occupied. But I think Ian also had something to that.
Yes, I just want to. I mean, I don't directly disagree with anything. So I just think I dispute the idea that there's necessarily a shift happening. And the analogy I'll use is that if you go out into the street, and you murder someone, if you drown someone in a puddle of water, of course he's going to flail his arms around, try and push his head out of the water. And you could say, well, there's a shift. People don't like to be drowned in a puddle in the street. Well, no, I don't think that signals a shift. I mean, they're pushing these huge. This is what I call artificial poverty on Europe. And of course, there's resistance to it, but I don't know if that's necessarily a shift. And I don't think that necessarily even means that the project's going to be unsuccessful.
Oh, I don't think this will translate into anything real. I'm just saying there is an actual revolt at the population level, but you're right that when it comes to substantial change, this is not it. Yeah, of course. Yes,
and the problem I would add, and I would elaborate on that to say what you have is you have captive elites here, because you have states, you have state governments, and you have nations of people. Like you have the Armenian state, you have the Armenian nation, you have the French government, you have the French nation. So you have these governments that are throwing their own nations of people of their own voters under the bus for the interests of that global elite. And they know it's going to lead to, impoverishment and in some cases the actual destruction of the state. Like I believe in Armenia's case, I think it's very likely there just won't be an Armenia in 10 years. I don't think it'll necessarily be that dramatic with France or Germany, but smaller states like Armenia that are closer to the edge to begin with, that can actually, or Ukraine in particular, doing
Ukraine
these
is
things.
a huge state, but you're right.
They can result in loss of statehood in some cases. And so it's like, are people at the grassroots level able to essentially overthrow their own governments and successfully replace them with a nationalist government that's not going to throw away their own national interests in the interests of Washington. So
yeah, good on you, tiny Georgia, for taking a different path, by the way.
Yeah, Georgia and Hungary, of course. Orban, he's looking out for his country. I wanted to
He's looking out for his legacy, but yeah, it's good for us that he is.
Fair. I wanted to talk about Sachs a little bit more. So Sachs did a really, really good interview with Tucker Carlson, but it's just amazing to see on multiple occasions Sachs really beat himself up, saying, "I am so naive." Like, I'm serious. Like, Sachs is like, "I am so naive." It's like, when is your credulity and naivety going to end, Jeffrey? Like, but I think Jeff is kind of, he's kind of one wing of this ruling class, right? He's the wing that would genuinely like for the ruling class to rule in a way that is way more beneficial for the masses, right? And it's not so
humanely.
More humanely, and really, he's a real champion of those liberal values. And most of the ruling class aren't anywhere like that. And I think that's kind of the best way to understand, his naivety. But it's just class. Like, if you're gonna ignore class, you're gonna get everything wrong. So that was my 2 cents.
What role does immigration have in all of this? I mean, we should touch upon that, shouldn't we?
A wedge issue, Carlo. A wedge issue. The elites can use immigration to divide the domestic society, and to obviously lower wages. But
in regard to the vote, I mean, Le Pen is obviously in the past has been, and present too, though she softened her rhetoric, has been against immigration. She's used that as a wedge issue. Maloney, to another, I mean, even though Italy, given its geographical area, has had to absorb an inordinate number of immigrants. So she's been making that case, and much of the continent, I mean, the European continent has been making that case. So that obviously had influenced the elections. And I think, and I'm going out on a limb here, but in another extent, since we're really talking about the right wing and their gains, is there any role that anti-Semitism in Gaza play in these elections? I mean, what are you guys' feelings on the immigration and the Gaza?
I think I was just going to tell you on that issue that the new right-wing factions that came, sort of the stars rising in Europe, they're all complete Zionists. I think there was a Haaretz article today that this is good news for our legitimacy in the Gaza war. That was in Haaretz. The left wing, the moderate Israeli paper. I just wanted to add that. But Max?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say that. I mean, and that's exactly why I think they spend so much time talking about how these parties are somehow like these Eurosceptic right-wing populist parties, and their recent political success is somehow being instigated or propelled by Russian meddling. When if you take a look at the political character of these parties, whether it's what's the one in Flanders, the Vlaams Belang, AFD in Germany, Sweden Democrats, UK Independence Party, La Liga, and on in Italy. They're all fanatically Islamophobic, and they're super pro-Israel. And they have direct dealings they've gotten, they've purchased, cyber meddling technology from all these weird, shadowy
Pegasus didn't get the attention
that are tied to Mossad and have done all this stuff, mining data on social media, but you never hear anything about that. You hear about the Internet Research Agency, which was owned by this like Russian oligarch and former hot dog salesman, that he's posted a bunch of memes of Hillary and Trump as the devil and Jesus playing chess against each other, like as if that somehow swung the 2016 election to Trump. They don't want to talk about the overwhelming presence of Israeli meddling, not only it's not just in the United States, it's also in the European Union. And that's one of the main reasons
he took his mask full off. Max's mask just came off, guys.
Oh, come on. Yeah. Yeah. Look at that nose. Look at that nose.
That was Prigozhin.
One of my biggest beefs with Orban is
the IRA, Internet Research Agency.
Did you know the ADL, speaking of immigration anti-Semitism, did you know the ADL is now openly advocating for NATO?
I did not.
Yes. I was reading this totally. I don't remember if it's the Atlantic or the New York Times, but they were quoting a spokesman from the Anti-Defamation League. He's like, and he was just upset. It's like, how could anyone be against NATO? I was like, what does NATO have to do with combating hate speech in the USA? Like, is NATO a protected group now? Is it now anti-Semitic to say NATO is bad? Apparently.
Well, they also delisted, the Azov battalion as like an extremist group, and then meanwhile they're like saying that like Jewish Voice for Peace and all these groups that are involved in these student occupations of American
actual Jews
are extremist groups. But the Azov battalion, which their leaders said that they wanted to lead the world in a crusade against Semite Untermenschen, they're not neo-Nazis.
It has to be added after 10 years, because even the US blocked weapons shipment to these guys. And now, I think this was yesterday, like a big breaking news Washington Post, the State Department found no evidence of human rights abuses or wrongdoing. So, yeah, that's when they whitelisted Azov again.
Yeah. Again,
we've got this guy in the comments denying that Israel meddles in. I mean, come on now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if someone says they are lobbying for Israel, I don't necessarily see the logic of saying, no, you're lying. You're not lobbying for Israel. Well,
I'm not sure we're going to have anybody that can really champion and steelman that perspective on this panel. It would be nice we should convene that panel in the future. But it's an interesting discussion. So I would like to spend a little bit talking about this topic. I'm not sure how much disagreement we're going to get with this panel. But, the exact nature of this relationship. So last time Max was on our program, we talked about the complexity of it, and that, it seems like neither the one extreme or the other. So one extreme says, Israel does not have any influence over U.S. foreign policy. Ultimately, it's U.S. interests that dictates it. And then there's the other one that says, the United States is Zionist occupied government. And that's another extreme. And so both of these, I think, are not nuanced enough, and they're both false in their, go ahead, Max.
Well, and it should be noted that Israel is not the only one that does this. And there's great comparisons you can make with Turkey. I mean, the Turkish lobby is also extremely powerful. I mean, you see how some of these local politicians like Bob Menendez in Jersey got wrapped up in this. But also, Ilhan Omar.
Take money from anyone.
Ilhan Omar, has had private meetings with Erdogan, which is why she abstained on the U.S. finally recognized the Armenian genocide for totally opportunistic reasons. It was because, if you remember, a few years ago, Trump withdrew troops from northern Syria very briefly, which was extremely unpopular with the Beltway blob and the war party duopoly. And how did they respond? They responded by rebuking him by voting to recognize the Armenian genocide, which they had not done for how many decades? Why? Because of the power of the Turkish lobby. And the only reason you even see some politicians, voice their support for it, someone like Adam Schiff, is only because he happens to preside over a district in California with a lot of Armenian Americans. But it's not to say that Israel is the only country that has this very powerful lobby that does this. It's also Turkey. It's the Saudis. So, I resent when somebody, is like somehow implying that like there's some anti-Semitic dog whistling going on, saying that AIPAC is powerful. Like, I'm sorry, this is just acknowledging reality. It doesn't mean that the government is Zionist occupied, or you're necessarily using, extreme right-wing rhetoric. It's just acknowledging a fact. And by denying that, you're really doing a disservice and getting in the way of having an honest conversation about the serious influence that Israel does have over the U.S. government.
It's been established since Kennedy because the lobby is the one that doesn't have to register, right, under the Foreign Agents Act.
Yeah. I want to bring up another example. There's Cubans also, and that's why I'm not saying immigration is bad, but it needs to be, a person who comes from one country to another isn't automatically, going to be an ally for the class struggle. I want to bring up Cuba because after the revolution, tons of people fled Cuba, and we know the meme. People often use fairly extreme methods to flee Cuba, but those were the disenfranchised, those were the plantation owners. And then what did they do? They all came to Florida, and those Cubans formed. They didn't join the class struggle; they joined the opposing side of the class struggle. That block of Cuban voters in Florida, and both Democrats and Republicans are terrified to annoy them because there's too many. They can swing Florida left or right, but depending on how they vote. And that's the main reason we to this day have those sanctions on Cuba. Most people don't care about Cuba anymore, but it's the Cubans, the expat Cubans themselves.
In the swing state of Miami, or the swing state of Florida.
And they have a couple other states, so they could potentially swing 2 or 3 states if
they wield disproportionate influence. It's not saying they dictate foreign policy, but they definitely influence it. That's totally true. Max, did you want to say something? I wanted to make a point about how it's not just Cuba, right? So it's the comprador elites that came from Vietnam that are here, typically the ones that that fought against the working class in that country. The same with Iran. It's the the aristocracy that was overthrown in the popular revolution that came here. The Chinese people, it's the same thing. They were fighting for Chiang Kai-shek, So that's just, we get all the fascists here. Go ahead.
I want to get into later the economics of the immigration issue. So I think Max should answer that one first. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and you can see how, the reason I brought up Turkey is because it's a perfect example of how it's the relationship goes 2 ways, and how when they butt heads, they will, like, for example, Turkey uses the fact that, they were very upset about the fact that the United States incorporated the Kurds into the SDF. And then, they also used that in the case of, they were trying to deny, or initially denying, Sweden's NATO membership because Sweden has historically supported the Kurds. And so when one side isn't getting its way, it will use its leverage to achieve its own individual goals. And the same thing is going on. You can see now with Israel, where the U.S. is clearly trying to throw Netanyahu under the bus, and you have these other Israeli politicians like Benny Gantz now jumping ship because they can see what's going on, that they're making Netanyahu the fall guy. Why? To save their own political ass. And so, there's different factions of the Israel lobby too that go to battle with each other. There's the Chaim Saban wing, and then there's the Sheldon Adelson wing. So that was why I used Turkey as an example, is because it might be a member of NATO, but it has its own individual interests. And so, like, for example, when they buy the S-400 from Russia, the U.S. all of a sudden you see in the media Erdogan is a dictator. So.
But that's because Turkey wants to join BRICS after a quarter of a century of not being allowed into the EU. So suddenly there's going to be Erdogan bad, I think, all over the place. Yeah.
Well, I want, before we move on, I want to mention what Billy Bob said, certain groups not necessarily controlling the American system, but punching above their weight. And in fact, I'll share, I don't know if this is going to hit all of the places this is streaming, but I would share a link to an article I wrote about that a while back. It's basically, it explains how the Electoral College and the legislative branch of the USA are set up. And it was designed to be a very resilient system. So even because this was designed, our legislative and constitutional government was set up back in the slavery area when you needed two groups of people who don't agree with each other on anything to have a coherent government. And what happens is, if you get a group of people, even if it's a small group, but they stick together and they're single issue voters, if they vote as a block, even if there's not very many of them, they can swing elections. And so we mentioned Cuba, we mentioned the Israel lobby. There's also, like, for example, the Polish lobby. There's a lot of Poles in the Midwest. And a lot of the reason Clinton bombed Belgrade, bombed Serbia, is because the Poles, you ask the Poles, what do you think of Yugoslavia? What do you think of Serbs? Oh, screw it, bomb the hell out of them, Unfortunately, there's just a lot of Polish expats in the Midwest who just were all about bombing the hell out of Serbs because they hate them. And so Clinton and Congress were like, well, let's bomb Serbs. Unfortunately, so this idea that they're always
a lot of Eastern Europeans made it to the halls of power. Brzezinski, I don't think, is a very English sounding name.
Ukraine has a pretty influential lobby as well.
Right.
Even if you don't have a lobby, I mean, like, we can see this playing out now with at the Arab American vote in Michigan. I mean, which is a huge key battleground state, and they're doing this protest vote with voting in the primaries undeclared. And if they don't vote in the election, that could swing that state to Trump. So these groups will use what they have, even if they don't have a very powerful lobby behind them, like AIPAC or the Turkish lobby or what have you.
Yeah, and Billy Bob was right. There's the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, very powerful, especially in upstate New York.
And in Canada, like hugely
Canada, yes.
Influential. Yeah. Right. So just to get another sort of aspect of this into, I mean, people, I think, tend to forget. I'm just going to start with Mr. Lindsey Graham, who had another pearl to drop about Ukraine's national resources. Probably some of you have seen it, but let's just watch it quickly. It's just 30 seconds.
If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin $10 or $12 trillion of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
I mean, he had to say it twice for emphasis. The 10 to 12, I think billion. I couldn't hear it, but I think billion worth of critical minerals. And interestingly enough, the German
trillion. I heard him say trillion.
Oh, trillion. Sorry, even better.
Trillion.
Yeah. The Germans said the same. If we want this green transition, we're going to need a lot of lithium, and the closest lithium we can have is in Donbass. Well, what the fuck is going on here? And I want to emphasize
that of the Soviet Union, and they want to make it the breadbasket of Europe.
By the way, Milorad Dodik, who was at SPIF, who is the undeclared leader of Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Orban, the same week said the same thing. They want to pick Russia apart and loot it like it's the 1990s. Both picked up by Russian.
There was a man from Germany that had a similar plan in 1939.
He had a tight little mustache, didn't he? Something, a failed painter or something like that. I don't know. But I just wanted to emphasize that when you mentioned Yugoslavia is a good enough analogy than anyone. After that was destroyed, people went all the way down into poverty, like distressed. And what do? They go abroad and they wash the dishes and tile the bathrooms in London and become an underclass. This is one tier of immigration. What you guys discussed earlier is the second tier. That's the golden parachute. They're not even called immigrants. They're called expats. You get, here's your golden bank account. Here's your nice house. both of these happen at the same time. And I think it's mischaracterized to go bleeding heart liberal and let's just give over half our house to anyone unfortunate enough to fall prey to our foreign policy. It should be when gone into the roots of, wait, what happened to these guys at home? So I think that's something that Europe and the US share in common. But yeah, the main difference is Europe has a history.
It's never allowed to be had.
I know. That's why I'm bringing it up. I know it's controversial,
so
but
Ben, they are very selective. Like, nobody can just come here. For instance, if you're asked, have you ever?
Can if they can work for 50 cents an hour and undermine. Look,
in this country, they're asked, have you ever been a member of a communist party? Do you think they ask that because they want communists here? No, they're very selective. They don't want those kinds of people coming here.
I think that's the top tier you're talking about. But when you're talking about the undocumented,
I was there when my wife was interviewed, and that's what they asked her. So.
Yeah, so the top is, I guess, the part of
where is your wife from, Billy Bob?
The Caribbean.
Okay.
I want to raise this point, about what Lindsey Graham said is actually a pretty classic case of a foreign lobby bribing someone under the table because Ukraine, because that's a Ukraine lobby talking point. That's because he's exaggerating the mineral wealth of, because I read up on that. I did see that video and I read up on it, and it's exaggerated because the problem is that, there's a couple of problems. The first one is that Ukraine's mineral wealth is not that special. Like most of it's, like the majority of that 12 or 14 trillion is coal, and coal is, it's dirty energy. It's inefficient energy. It doesn't really have a future. And the other problem is that energy companies just don't want high risk ventures like war, like Iraq, there's this meme that, we invaded Iraq for the oil. When really, if you look at the sales after Saddam was toppled and the USA sold off the oil fields, American companies only got 1 or 2 fields. The rest went to China, Russia, even, and European companies in the EU. Because American companies, even before Bush invaded Iraq, American oil companies were just like, no. A war is not good for business. War is not good for business. It's a high risk.
The piece that comes after is where all the money is made.
Well, the problem is that American companies, and I think corporations in general, but particularly American corporations, are very risk adverse. So there is an argument to be made that it was just Saddam was that major. He was that big. If you look at those 3 big dogs in the Middle East: Israel, Iran, and Iraq. We came in and got rid of one of them. So who is the beneficiary? It was not American industry that benefited from Iraq.
I don't know if Raytheon and Lockheed are risk averse. I think they thrive on that kind of risk.
Well, they're defense clients.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. There's different sectors, different monies. Yeah.
And Ben, I wasn't disagreeing with you earlier. I wasn't saying that, you were making the point that, just allowing everybody in can have problems. It can result in problems. But I'm saying from the perspective of the ruling class, they're already kind of selective because they're not, bringing in all the revolutionaries, right? They're bringing in all the counter-revolutionaries. And to a great extent.
Yeah, sure, but I think you're still talking about the top tier, talking about the expats. But I wanted to make this point about the tiered societies that basically, if you can, this is the economics of large companies who are always in the US and in the British Financial Times, these kinds of magazines saying, do not change the immigration laws because we need that foreign labor to keep our profits sharp. Meaning if someone can undermine you for working $1 an hour and not 10, that is by design. That is also whether they're left or right doesn't enter it. It's replacement parts for the machine. So if you say no to a job because the pay is too low, there can be whatever, an Indian or a Syrian guy on the street who just take it. So I think people overlook this aspect, that a lot of this is very beneficial to the margins of these corporations.
Yeah. Influx of skilled medical labor from Nigeria, India, the Philippines. It's definitely keeping keeping costs down, keeping wages down.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to make the comparison. This is what Lindsey Graham wants with Ukraine. So where do you think the Ukrainians are going to work? They might be TikTokers, or they might be washing, service work somewhere in Western Europe. They're not going to be the golden parachute, Reznikovs, who I think got a US passport recently, the former defense minister of Ukraine. Yeah, the Lamborghini guys. That's one layer. But yeah, they
Or
become
Guaido.
tiered society.
Guaido.
And Guaido. Yeah. They're not the celeb immigrants, I guess you would call them.
I have a question for Ian. So were you, just to have you clarify or elaborate, were you trying to say that you thought that the Iraq war was the post-war profits came more from the reconstruction than from the theft of the resources? Is that what you?
Well, it wasn't quite the point I was driving at, but as far as who benefited, yeah, it was definitely not the energy profits, that because very little of the oil industry actually even went to the USA. Most went to China and Russia and the European Union companies there. Well, out of I forget the exact numbers, but however many fields were sold, only one or two of them went to American companies. My main point was that it was less to do with profit, because and I set that as an example because Lindsey Graham is making Ukraine sound like this powerhouse of mineral wealth,
Like Afghanistan or something.
right? And he's exaggerating. I think he's exaggerating it for the benefit of the Ukraine lobby, not necessarily the energy lobby or any of those other lobbies, not a company per se. It's the Ukraine lobby itself. Because like you said, the Ukrainian lobby is very large in Washington. So not to say he necessarily got campaign contributions for him, but I think it's that lobby that's speaking through him, because it's an exaggeration of Ukraine's economic clout.
It's so ridiculous what's happening. By the way, how's all that going? Still lobbying the US. I mean, these are the guys they are now bringing to the front lines. I guess they switched they switched to people who can no longer run away or something. So that's the terrible state that they're in. And there's two things taking part. One, Lavrov just came home to open the BRICS conference, where already there's 49 other nations wanting to join not just BRICS, but the SCO and the Eurasian Economic Union or something like that, right? At the same time, I love that Max brought up that the reconstruction of Germany for cheap. That's where the UK reconstruction conference just began, where I collected some of Zelensky's statements. This is today, so fresh off the printing press, and he wants, I guess, $1 trillion to rebuild Ukraine, but at least $500 million for immediate repairs. He wants more air defense. He wants the Ukrainians to come home, and from here, I guess he's heading into the Global Peace Conference in Sweden, where nobody's coming, not even Guterres. So it's looking really bad. You can still do this PR and the lobbying thing, but if the actual conflict is lost, how's that going for you?
Well, they're even forcibly deporting like Ukrainian refugees who are of military or fighting age.
Which guys? Poland probably, or the Baltics? These are the most rabid.
Poland, Estonia. I don't know if the Western European countries have started doing it, but they've been forcing these people to go to the front lines who avoided service.
And they're running. There are more and more articles of them just climbing through the Carpathian Mountains, besting. The Tisza River has been mined specifically to cut the escape routes. I just can't imagine anything like that. Tear them apart with a mine.
And fodder. Yeah, hundreds of thousands of them.
So, Lindsey Graham talked about, the West we really need to win. I mean, there is $12 trillion. We can't hand that to Putin and Xi. But what are they going to do? Like, what is the mechanism by which? So it's like he's saying we're gonna throw money at it, and by magic we're gonna get our victory. Like, I mean, it's
been made clear. There's no
dumping money down a black hole.
Yeah, that's just.
I want to answer this question.
Okay.
Well, Yes and no. So of course BlackRock. I don't think BlackRock cares that much. I think from the BlackRock perspective, they would just like the war to be over so they can do something with the stuff they bought in Ukraine. But there, you remember, both the USA and Canada have very large ethnic Ukrainian expat populations. So it's them. You know, some of them are rich, some of them aren't rich, but there's lobbyists. They're lobbyists.
By the way,
there's a couple actually very good Gray Zone. If you go on the Gray Zone website and look, they actually have a couple of very good articles talking about the Ukraine lobby specifically and how.
I mean, even Stepan Bandera's number 2. I was watching a RT documentary about Ukraine recently. One of his, I don't know if it was his number 2, but it was one of his most immediate successors. Even went to the White House and met with George H.W. Bush and was photographed with him in the 1980s. This is when, you know,
not wrong.
It was still under the Soviet times, but this was when the Ukrainian diaspora and the nationalist groups really were lobbying for independence, which they eventually got when the Soviet Union collapsed. But yeah, I mean, George W. Bush was actually pictured with one of the actual war criminals during the Second World War that was involved with, you know, all the war crimes and atrocities that went on under the Banderites.
Max,
like Justin Trudeau, you know, in his parliament.
Yeah, yeah.
My wife and I were filming, we're taping that just serendipitously. We were down at the mall taping the AIDS quilts, and we saw this a rally going on to the left, and it looked like a bunch of guys in Eagle Scout uniforms on the stage. So we went over to tape it, and sure enough, they were on there, and there were people giving the Nazi salute and that sort of thing. We were interested in it, and but as soon as we started shooting, they tried to take our cameras away. We sort of rushed out of there.
Well, it was sensitive back then.
I was back in the day. You know, you're absolutely right, and I'm sure that was back in the Bush years, Bush senior years. Yeah.
Okay. On the point that Ian made, there was a very important article. I think it was all the way back in March or April, went unnoticed, but it was, you know, Bloomberg or Fortune, one of the big financial magazines, that even the big guys who invested so much in Ukraine, I think BlackRock was named, were starting to write down the money. We're going to get some money out now because we don't know how long this can go on, and because we don't know if we're going to get paid back. Even they kind of realized that the situation on the ground doesn't match their dreams. And I have to add for the British, who have bought a lot of critical stuff in and around the port of Odessa. And, you know, the reason for like 15 of the Western armies invading the Soviet Union fresh out of his crib wasn't because Lenin was a bad man and it was Soviet Union, but because they said all of our foreign debts are nullified. We're not going to pay them. And that kind of shit is exactly what's going to happen if there is no Ukraine. Because why do you think they'll respect the agreements with BlackRock, with the NATO countries, with all that debt, 100 billion at least sent by the EU? Do you think that's going to get paid back?
That's why they can't lose. But on the other hand, how could they possibly win? But
well, there is one scheme that came out over the weekend, which I loved. They put it to the press. Zelensky, it came from his office, that some of the F-16s that we're getting from the Belgians and these guys, the Holland, we're going to keep them in safe bases in the West, and that's how we're going to get away with it. And immediately there was a Russian response from an MP, I forgot his name, but he said, well, they become legitimate targets, but they want to get away with this legalistic speech. You know, that's not NATO. That's not Article 4 or 5. You know, we're going to keep them there.
I don't think
that's how they want to get the big dog US in, saying them, the Poles and Romania can say Article 5, bring the US into those recent maps that you saw, right? The military Schengen, we bring the Yankees into the ports and they can all be sent to the front. That's their last hope, and it's not going to happen ever.
Speaking of
10 cents.
Romania, there are a lot of Romanians, obviously, in Moldova, and my prediction is one of the next theaters in the U.S.-Russia proxy war, Cold War 2.0, could potentially open as a powder keg brewing is Transnistria with the in its frozen conflict with Moldova. It's
Transnistria, yes. It has, I think, two undeclared but not aligned with Maya Sandu and the government regions who desperately want to get with Russia because they see the writing on the wall. And as soon as these guys are out of people with these old parts, poor guys, in Ukraine, Odessa will not be left for Ukraine. There is no way. And that's when they connect. That when Russia connects to that area to Moldova.
Yeah, I mean they would be next in line because Russia's come to the aid of South Ossetia and Abkhazia were first, obviously, and then Donbass, obviously. So now I would think that would be the next chip to fall potentially.
Yeah, it's just thinning the lines. I love that people like the Washington Post said, "Oh, the offensive in the Kharkov region has failed. It stopped in its tracks." It wasn't meant to take land again. It was meant to thin out the front even more. I can't wait for them to get into Sumy, where over the weekend there was been some chatter from Kadyrov that we took some village in Sumy, and Zelensky said the counteroffensive was successful and we took down a flag. It was just a psyop. But it's
they've been saying full-scale invasion for 2 years. I mean, if it was a full-scale invasion, they would have taken the country 2 years ago. I mean, how the
fuck do these Western politicians still ferry in and out of Kiev all the time?
They've never stated any intention that they have any intention to get rid of Zelensky, conduct regime change, take the whole country. It's just insane, the rhetoric that they get away with without any facts to back it up.
I wanted to bring up
this. I think Todd will not be respected, but go ahead.
Well, what was it? 2015 or 2016? There was this shadowy prop or not organization that got a big front page story in the Washington Post, I think. Yes. And it was basically a blacklist of all these Russian, propaganda outlets. So, what were some of those outlets? I mean, I'm not sure the gray zone was that big back.
All those motherfuckers who edit Counterpunch after Alexander Coburn died, those fucking cowards. Jeffrey Lispy, whatever your fucking name is, and Joshua Frank. They started purging all their Sputnik left, as Jeffrey St. Clair calls them, or pro-Russian authors, and totally changed the makeup of that whole publication. I mean, there's still a few people there who are okay, but that was their response. But yeah, Counterpunch was on there. I don't know if the Gray Zone was founded yet. I think it might have just been in its infancy. But they put Black Agenda Report on there. They put a whole host of
probably democracy now. Back in the day, now it's completely
it was just an insane list of Consortium News, obviously.
Yeah, Consortium News was the one I was trying to think of. But that was that was Ukrainian. That group, Prop or Not, had Ukrainian lobby. That was from the Ukrainian lobby because they really didn't want Trump. And I think that what happened under Biden with the SMO, I think that was 4 years delayed. I think they were really trying to get that under Hillary. They had big plans under Hillary, and that all got delayed because of Trump, and they had to put things off. But anyway, that's just some speculation. So we did not get to. We're going back and forth, and that's okay. But I want to talk about the relationship between Israel and the United States, and I did want to bring up this article in the Washington Post. It was the leaked cables of this WhatsApp group chat that started October 7th, 2023. And the Washington Post describes it as 100 billionaires and business titans in this months-long running group chat where they eventually invite on the mayor of New York City to discuss ways to disperse these protesters from Colombia, which was just one aspect of what they were talking about. But overall, they were talking about how do we benefit Israel? How can we, get, U.S. support for Israel and undermine popular support for the Palestinians, because they were very upset. These 100 billionaires and business titans were upset at how the pro-Palestinian sentiment, how popular it was in this country. And I'm kind of surprised too. But what does that say about this relationship that you can have 100 billionaires and business titans, according to the Washington Post? And then the Washington Post, of course, is going through a shakeup just now. Some people just
I was going to say you're connected to today's huge crisis. I think they lost half their readership. They're changing the main editor or the boss somehow. Like huge crisis at the Washington Post. Yeah, because I think we discussed this at some other joints.
But not with Max.
Go ahead, everyone.
Not with Max. And I want his Max off approach. I'm just kidding, Max.
I would just say, look, I mean, of course, this is a very fraught topic.
Yeah.
I mean, and I would clarify that I obviously the response from the U.S. police state towards political protests by college students, we don't have to remind everyone of the history, but I will anyway. You know, going back to Kent State, the 1960s, the response during Occupy was extremely brutal. Everybody remembers UC Davis, the cops casually pepper spraying. So
I remember that it became a meme.
Would be brutal anyway. They've always been brutal. It's always going to be brutal. But yes, there is something undeniably significant. The fact that they have that kind of entree, these billionaires, into the ear of Eric Adams, who, by the way, has visited Israel several times, and that they're able to be in that kind of proximity. And it's not to say that they gave the NYPD the direct order to try and evict these protesters. They would do that anyway, but nevertheless, they do clearly have this unprecedented influence. So we have to be honest with ourselves here. We can't just, I mean, I think there are some people out there, you know, like, I love him, like Kevin Barrett, but, you know, he's one of these people that's always just quickly to just jump, see they're acting under direct orders of, we have a Zionist occupied government. And it's just like, I think that we know that, and I even saw him on Press TV trying to deny that he was even trying to say that, they don't usually typically respond to student protests this way. I'm like, really? What have you been? Because in my experience, it's always been brutal. But I do think it's significant with the article you share because it shows how much of a unprecedented influence they have in having the ear of the mayor of the biggest city in the country.
So it's amazing to me that, number one, that story isn't bigger. Like, I really haven't heard anything about it. Like, it came out in the Washington Post several weeks ago, and again, these chat logs were secreted away from WhatsApp and given. Somebody, a whistleblower, a leaker, leaked these documents, gave them to the Washington Post. The Washington Post is sitting on these documents. They did one article, and I assume that article is heavily whitewashed and sanitized. Of the 100 billionaires and business titans, we know of 9 names. Of course, they're all, wealthy people who identify as Jewish and obviously pro-Israel. So we don't know who the other 91 people are, but I imagine they have the same, perspective on politics, and Israel and Zionism is very important to them, which, we get pushback from that from some people. They say, well, just because they're wealthy people who love Israel doesn't mean that, Israel is their number one priority. They could be just liberal values. They just want liberal values. And, but.
I looked this up, but I remember reading about this, that the term deep state didn't originate with Trump. It originated with a scandal in Turkey where they found the head of police, some drug lords and all of that in places where they shouldn't have been. And this scandal story about, your elected leaders and the massive billionaires, wealthy people are complete. It should have had the same.
I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Ergenekon in Turkey, I think that they were somehow connected with, what is it, the Grey Wolves, or the group that was, during Operation Gladio, they had the clandestine stay behind network. And I think it was the Grey Wolves in Turkey that it was somehow connected with, the Ergenekon, who have a very shadowy hold over Turkish politics and the Turkish government.
You might be right. I have surface level knowledge.
The Grey Wolves took credit for downing that Russian jet over Syria a while ago.
And I think that they were even when the guy that tried to assassinate John Paul II back in the 80s, I think he was in the Grey Wolves. I don't know much about them. I didn't
mean to distract. I just wanted to, the term deep state came from a situation just like this. when it
So
was.
let me make 2 quick points, and then we can go wherever. But so number one, the article from the Washington Post. If you want to avoid the paywall, you can go to the description of this video. It's there in the description of this video. Hopefully that link works. And then the mayor's office, the vice mayor, also a Zionist, was quoted in that article saying that they are disgusted by the Washington Post engaging in these anti-Semitic tropes, suggesting that Jewish Americans are wielding their influence to affect government policy. And he's disgusted by the Washington Post. So again, maybe that's why there's a little bit of a shakeup at the Washington Post right now, because now here's the problem with the Washington Post. The Washington Post would never, they were probably wishing they'd never got those leaked cables, because once they received those leaked cables, they had no choice but to put an article out about them, because if they didn't and it came out that they were sitting on these, I mean, that's an even bigger scandal.
Well,
I mean,
there's been shakeups at a lot of different media organizations. I mean, there were Intercept had a story about how there were internal memos, telling New York Times reporters, don't say the word Palestinian territory, avoid these keywords. And a lot of people have quit, and even within the State Department, there's been State Department officials resign. There's a lot of internal conflict going over this issue, and it has to do with they're trying to control, the narrative management about this. And there are some people who are finally just not able to don't want to be complicit in it, I guess, even in a place like the CIA's favorite rag, the Washington Post, the Bezos Post.
Good. I wanted to say this point because I think you made the very fair point. It is just a fact that the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby, is hugely effective in the US. They're very strong. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say at all. They have sway. But the other side is, and this brings us to some recent news. I don't know if you picked this up. It's kind of lower in the cheat sheet, but in West Asia, the Saudis, 2 days ago, which was the 9th of June, they didn't renew a 50-year-old, what was termed, the petrodollar contract, security in exchange for only doing things in the dollar. And before that, this was last week, they joined the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, and a sort of a Chinese initiative, a Chinese digital central bank currency initiative. So while the US really, really wants to have, as Todd correctly says, only 2 areas in the world have been described as the unsinkable aircraft carrier. This is one, Israel. The second one, of course, is Taiwan. They need it in the oil heartlands to have a way to project power in there. When they misbehave, they have some trouble, especially during election year, because I think all three who have remained in this coalition government pretty clearly stated they want an all-out war with Lebanon. It's all about we're going in. After this ridiculously bloody and horrific scene that they did at the Nusayrat refugee camp, they killed 3 of their own hostages while rescuing 4 others and killing at least, I don't know where the tally is, at least 250 people. But if you look,
yeah.
Something like that, and it goes up to 500 if you count the wounded, count the collateral damage. A horrific failure, anyway you look at it.
They didn't land the helicopter on the pier, okay? It was next to the pier.
That's what, Hamas comes in, which you wouldn't see in the West, saying, that pier was utilized. They were put into aid trucks, and that's how they got into the area, and they said it's fair game. This is a legitimate target to us now. So that turned the whole American thing around. But what I'm saying is, an all-out, let's burn the region down might be logical in the head of Netanyahu, but right now, in the U.S. leadership circles, I'm not talking about the cadaver, I'm talking about, Blinken, Sullivan, those guys, they don't want the oil region to burn, which can be said by Bill Burns, CIA guy, their actual negotiator going into the region, Blinken flying down to his 7th critical, come on, please accept our terms. The UN has accepted it. Come on, we'll make Israel accept it, but please Hamas accept it. He's in that desperate state and making, we watched it, I think, before the show. This, I don't know how you can lie this blatantly, but this statement, as he arrived in Egypt at the airport.
And of course, what separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies when it comes to incredibly difficult situations like this is our respect for international law and, as appropriate, the laws of war.
Yeah, that's what they do. Everybody, it's obvious. They respect international law and the laws of war. That's what they do.
Let me underscore your point, Ben. So what you're saying is that Israel might be interested, the Israel government, the current government in Israel might be interested in, initiating a war with Lebanon and really heating that region up exponentially, whereas it's the United States, the empire runners that really are trying very hard to avoid that.
Right now they are. That is what I see.
They're really not interested in seeing that get out of hand.
But the last time Israel fought Hezbollah, it really did not go well for them, as I recall.
Yeah, and it's been 7 or 8 years. I mean, imagine what Hezbollah has now with the help of Iran.
But
I think it's very unfair to call them proxies, but they're up.
They can devastate Lebanon with standoff weapons. I mean, Israel has a lot of air weapons and missiles that could just devastate Lebanon and bomb it back to the Stone Age, and that's not even with a tank invasion they could do that. So
come on, don't you think Lebanon has learned from Hamas and Gaza? Basically, most of the stuff they just took their 7th, I think, Hermes, like I don't know how many $1 million.
I think drone. What's making Israel second guess that is not that they couldn't do that to Lebanon; it's that Lebanon could also do that to them. I think that's what's. So I think Israel has the power to destroy it, but Lebanon has the power to destroy Israel, and that's what's holding them back. But they both have some destructive power that they don't want to initiate.
Yeah, that was the last clip for today. But yeah, they have to think about the consequences ever since Iran did that payback. And the country without a navy has stopped like 90% of the traffic through the Suez Canal. Yeah, like apparently this can only be rumor, but the Ike. The Eisenhower has been hit, the aircraft carrier, and 3 days, this is what the Houthis claimed, and 3 days later, the captain of it, who likes to share like NAFO memes, put out a video that was half a year old to prove nothing's happened to the Eisenhower. And meanwhile, they're like inching up towards the Suez Canal trying to get away. Amazing stuff. Yeah, so they can't just do whatever the fuck they want anymore.
The U.S. denied that the aircraft carrier was hit. But I thought that a couple of days later, like yesterday or the day before, a British ship was actually hit.
That's true, a tanker, right? Not a military.
Well, no, I thought it was a military ship, and I thought Britain admitted that a military ship got hit. But I was reading Telegram, and so you can't always trust Telegram.
Yeah.
The issue is that, and here's my issue, like with the whole 12-dimensional chess, this is all part of the plan. Well, I mean, if you look at Biden's cabinet, if you look at Blinken, if you look at Lloyd Austin, these people are not competent. They are the products of nepotism. And, they're not the products of a meritocracy. Like if you look at Austin, I mean, he's associated with a litany of failures in Iraq and Syria. So this idea that, I mean, it's true. I mean, because Reagan threatened to pull the plug on Israel, and that made them stop the genocide they were doing at that particular moment. But I don't think Biden or the people around him are competent enough or just have the stones to just make that phone call, say, hey, do what we want or we'll cut you off. I don't think that conversation's happened. I don't think they're actually capable of making that ultimatum. For whatever, we can speculate on the reasons why, but they just haven't.
Yeah, their domestic political opposition would use it against them, saying, "Hey, you're throwing Israel under the bus. You're anti-Israel," and that would hurt them politically. But yeah, I mean, I think.
Yeah, but Biden also is dealing with the writings on the wall with the younger generation. He's losing the youth vote, which is, I mean, so he's having to weigh his options. It's
good point. I think, well, where does the money come from? The pro-Palestine lobby?
Yeah,
good point.
Filthy rich.
It's true, but the problem is that, the problem right now is that, and I will say that all the things that, for the most part, what I wrote about October 7th, I did write a couple of articles after that, and pretty much everything I said, I was completely astonished at that this has dragged on for what are we even at right now? 8 months now, I guess. 8 months, 9 months. I mean, I would have like, okay, this is going to go on for a couple of months, and Israel is going to be forced to, have some sort of way to declare a victory a month or two into this. I was completely floored that they're just dragging on for 8-9 months. I mean, it's not making Biden look good. I mean, I think you're right. If President Trump threw Israel under the bus, that would hurt him more with his Republican supporters than
that
with
would hurt him
Biden.
big time.
But the problem with Biden is that, he's got those younger voters. He's got those minority voters. He has those Arab voters. He has basically anyone who's not white or Christian who's like, hey, what the hell are you doing?
I don't think that's true anymore. But, oh, yeah. Sorry. I thought you mean he has those voters in his pocket. But the opposite.
Right.
The opposite.
Yes. Because those white evangelical Christians are so in the pockets of the Israel lobby. Like even mom and pop type people are like, I mean, I grew up in a Baptist church. I mean, like I remember like a kid's sermon because you have the youth group where the kids go during the grown-up sermon, and like I remember that. I remember to this day this speech by the youth pastors, like, we have to support Israel because in the end times, in the battle for Armageddon, they're going to be fighting the Arabs, they're going to be fighting the Chinese. I don't know why the Chinese were there, but apparently the Chinese also sent like a 10 million man army, a small army of 10 million men to also fight Israel. It was crazy. But so they're in the pocket of the Israel lobby, but the Democrat voters, those non-white voters, those non-Christian voters are not so much. And
I want to make a final point, which I guess I'm echoing to people like Dust and the American left in general, that what I really want you to see is just like the Israel lobby, the finance capital of billionaires anywhere in the world is not monolithic. They do not have this one big plan or agenda. They have huge disagreements. I think Apple just released that it will be integrating ChatGPT on a hardware level, which means 24/7 monitoring. And I think Elon Musk, another huge billionaire, said, I'm going to ban Apple products from me. They have these disagreements, right? It's very erroneous to look at them. And at the top, these selected managers like Blinken, like Sullivan, like the Admiral Kirby, they have different. I mean, there's this guy, Elbridge Colby, a Trump advisor on military matters. He's been writing an editorial every week saying, basically, I'm paraphrasing, fuck Ukraine, let it burn. Let's focus on China because we have limited time, limited resources, and they're the big threat to us. They're the ones who are going to undermine us in where it matters. The dollar, the book. And that is, don't treat them as this, how the right wing treats the WEF. They have this huge plan of depopulation, degrowth, which they have these plans, but they are not the one voice of everybody who's more richer than, I don't know, like a medium startup. So that's a huge mistake, because then you won't see the strategic differences and the mistakes they make. Okay,
that's a very good point and very well said. I totally agree.
Thank you.
I just have one final comment, which is that I'm very disappointed we didn't get to the most substantive topic this week. I know it just broke right before that Hunter Biden and his enormous penis have been convicted in the gun charges. So very disappointed we didn't get to that, guys.
Just last week, every headline was Trump is a convicted felon. You can't elect a convicted felon. So now I guess the first child, or how do they call
the very well endowed first child, I must add. I don't know if you guys have seen this stuff circulating on Reddit, but it's just hysterical to me.
Yeah,
the smoking crack with prostitutes. And,
well, the seemingly underage prostitutes.
I'm scarred for life. Yes.
I mean, it seemed like they looked like very, 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 very young prostitutes. But it's just amazing that it's gun charges. After you see him smoking crack, you see the underage prostitute, and it's gun charges is what they get on. It's just weird.
And how many people were put away by the 1994 crime bill for the very same crime, which
Smoking
Biden offered? Yeah.
I think, and I'll do a closing thought on that exact issue. I think, I actually called it, I think it's a very common strategy when you have someone like, oh my gosh, what was his name? That Italian guy in New York, Billy Bob. Do you remember that Italian guy? He got hemmed up for sex. He's the governor of New York.
Cuomo?
No, Cuomo, the COVID.
Cuomo.
He's got the nipple piercings, right?
Yes, he was the one who got hemmed up for sexual harassment, and he had and I bring that up because he was under the gun for so many different things, like deliberately putting COVID positive people in nursing homes to infect the elderly, to artificially increase the number of
I
people
remember
killed
this,
by COVID.
yeah.
I mean, there were so many awful things he was under the gun for. But then they got him on, he's made inappropriate comments to some girl at his office. And then he quietly resigned and left the public spotlight. I think that's essentially what they're doing with Hunter Biden. There's so many things they could hem him up for, but they took something pretty low. They'll say, oh, you lied on this federal background check for a firearm. And so we're going to they'll probably give him like maybe jail time. I don't know if they'll even give him jail time.
Community service, slap on the wrist.
Some slap on the wrist. Then he'll walk free for the pedophilia, crack, and all this other crazy crap he was under the gun for. It's a very common strategy of just picking something very low, give him a slap on the wrist so they can say, oh, look, no one's above I think that's exactly what I think we're going to see, some headlines like that. They'll say this proves that no one is above the law. We got Trump because he's a criminal, but we also got Hunter Biden and gave him a slap on the wrist like the bad boy he is. So that's my question.
Well, we got another hour. We can talk about the
Oh my gosh, don't even make the
It may not be over for Hunter Biden.
It may not. Yeah.
And remember that they had to get Al Capone on income tax evasion.
I just want to mention, this is not fresh or today's news, but over the last week, 3 articles came out. One was the Time magazine showing the complete transcript of an interview with Biden with every, he can't speak, and you can clearly see that there. Second, Wall Street Journal about a week ago also said behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping. He doesn't perform very well. And the latest came from Politico, which is Biden insists he's not involved in the family's business dealing, but his aides tell a different story, which just someone doesn't want this guy to be the nominee. So on the one hand, you have convicted felon who can, I guess, lead the U.S. from the courtyard at the jail with Secret Service or something. And on the other side, you have the cadaver who shot himself at Normandy, who this is him dancing. This is a beautiful.
The legal experts are saying though that Trump's conviction is he could win on appeal. That's what I've seen a lot of legal experts saying, but I don't know.
I don't know either, but for me, thank goodness I'm not in the US. I can't wait for November. This is going to be the best show.
The race to the bottom, if there ever was one.
I have not seen those. I've heard the headlines about Biden freezing, but I haven't seen those images. Those are kind of scary. It's like, what kind of meds do they have him on that is resulting in those
Hillary had a moment like that. It wasn't quite freezing, but like there was a talk with a reporter, and she just.
You remember those spasms?
Yeah, she just spazzed out, and
they've got to be on very similar cocktails that result in those weird behaviors. It's crazy.
Transfusion from teenage blood. I don't know. Sorry, YouTube. I didn't. That was a joke.
The blood
satire.
of Russian babies, right? Just a joke.
I will say, when you reach my age, it's much harder to get through the day.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, there is that.
You don't have a nuclear football at home,
He's got a crazy schedule and a lot of activities and events that he has to do, and a lot of travel. But still, it's just a weird. It's a weird, just freezing like that. I mean,
to be fair, Trump has been looking pretty old himself lately, I have to say, and there's definitely a lot of evidence of his cognitive decline too. I mean, they're both in rough shape, but Trump, he can at least hold these massive rallies, whatever cocktail they're giving him to get through it. But Biden, I don't know how he's going to survive these debates in 2 weeks. I don't know what's going to happen.
No, they're inappropriate for that.
AI. They'll use AI. They'll make AI Biden.
Just the way I get through my day, I would not want to be in that position for anything. I couldn't physically do it.
Yeah.
So I know it firsthand what it's like. So.
He's really sacrificing for the good of the class.
Oh,
He's been sacrificing. I mean, it can't be. I wouldn't want that on
I
my
know
list.
it's maybe 10 years younger, but Lavrov and Putin look hell of a lot more fit. They actually do. Not that young.
And Lavrov is a chain smoker, so.
Putin's
but
70 now. 70. Yeah.
Yeah, probably a good 10 years younger than Trump and Biden. So, okay, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to come back on Friday with more special guests. We should have had somebody that maybe disagreed more, Max. We could have had a good debate, but I think we had a fun discussion.
Well,
So
thank you, Dust, for making comments that were
thought-provoking.
Against the grain, yeah.
No, we appreciate that Dust's perspective, and we will definitely have him back. Anyway, we'll see you guys on Friday. Thank you very much.